Welcome to the Veterinary Cancer Pioneers Podcast, the show where we delve into groundbreaking work of veterinary professionals who are dedicated to advancing the field of veterinary oncology. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel Venable, and I'm thrilled to embark on this journey with you. Welcome to the Veterinary Cancer Pioneers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel Venable, and I am so excited today that we have Dr. Philip Bergman with us. And when I think of a pioneer, Dr. Bergman, your face, your background really comes to mind. And thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I don't know that I deserve this pioneer status, but I appreciate the interest.
You're welcome. But I think looking at your background, your bio, I would say that you can fit in that pioneer background. You are the director of clinical studies for VCA. So anybody in veterinary medicine knows VCA is a huge group. So being a director, that's quite an accomplishment. You're also adjunct faculty at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and you were the principal veterinary investigator for the Canine Melanoma Vaccine Oncept, which was fully licensed in 2009. So we'll talk more about that because that's quite an exciting endeavor. And the other thing on your background that I find really interesting is you completed a PhD fellowship in human cancer biology from the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. You know, unless you live under a rock and you've never heard of cancer, everybody knows that's a huge cancer center for people. You know, I know a lot of people, you try to get, go there for treatment or even doing they do some telehealth visits and things. But anyway, what was it like being a veterinarian there at that program?
I'll be honest, it was a scary first 6 months. I remember specifically saying to my wife then that I think I've made a mistake. She said something that has stuck with me for a long time. She goes, "You're out of your normal routine. You've now gone up another level when it comes to sort of the training side of things. And of course, you're going to feel like a fish out of water." And what really happened is that, I went from a residency, and you know what that's all about. Hardcore clinical training, some didactic training, but you're really being trained to be a clinician, not a scientist. And what I learned very quickly when I made that move to Houston to do that, even though I was brought on, I think, in a different way than a typical grad student, because the site that I ended up choosing at MD Anderson, the department chair was a DVM PhD by the name of Josh Fidler. And Josh Fidler is kind of known in the scientific world as kind of the seed and soil hypothesis guy when it comes to metastatic biology. But what he did is he cultivated me, and this is compared to like Duke and Stanford and a couple other places that I think academically are probably stronger than MD Anderson, but they put together a package that made more sense to me because I wasn't going to be treated like a typical graduate student. I was coming in then as a DVM that had already done a master's, had done a residency, gotten boarded at that point. And so Josh, or Dr. Fidler, said, "Hey, we're going to get you an American Cancer Society fellowship. So it'll be better for you financially. That fellowship will bring money to the lab that you'll be at in my department." And they really rolled out the red carpet very differently than, like the Dukes and the Stanfords of the world. And that's what told me, let's go to MD Anderson, even though it's not as academically potentially as strong. But that first 6 months was just amazing to me because, clinicians and researchers talk differently. Those two hands, as I've learned, don't talk well to each other. We all know clinicians speak, and we don't necessarily know everything from a scientific and molecular speak. And that first 6 months were tough ones. Once I got the lingo down and started to kind of understand how a clinician navigates that, then I said, okay, I'm back into my normal frame of reference. And yeah, it was hard being that far into your career and going back and taking, graduate biochemistry and graduate this and graduate that. It was a long and hard 5.5, 6 years that I spent there, but I'm so glad that I did because, it opened up a lot of doors that I don't think would have opened up without it, especially when I then went to AMC and, with Sloan Kettering. And, for a lot of folks that aren't familiar, those two groups always go back and forth as the top two human cancer centers, being MD Anderson in Houston and Sloan Kettering in New York. They're always 1-2, and it depends on the year. They flip back and forth.
Yeah, that's really exciting that you've been able to be involved with both those really renowned programs. And I can only imagine, like you said, feeling like a fish out of water and having to relearn new things. What do you think helped you just in general to keep pushing through? I mean, you've certainly pushed through a lot, right? Getting through vet school and specialty and then that PhD. What do you think might help other people, right? Like younger vets or maybe people wanting to be vets? Like, where did you kind of find that strength, or what would you recommend? Is it like having a great friend or partner, like, like you said, your wife helped you?
Each of us have had in our journeys mentors that pushed you. And, I think back to Withrow and Rod Straw and those types of folks, which I'm forever indebted to. I think about, Roger Fingland in my internship at Kansas State. He pushed me to keep going and take the next step. Greg Ogilvie was instrumental in me becoming an oncologist because he was there at the right time during vet school that I said, maybe this is something that I want to do, even though I was very interested in, I thought I was going to be either a dairy practitioner or I thought I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon, and quickly figured out neither of those were for me. And it's funny how those little tiny things that happen in life, in addition to a strong mentor, really gets you to refocus and think about potentially different things. Another one at school was Eric Egger, who was a surgeon there, and said, we can tell you care and you work hard, and we want you to take those extra next steps. And those people can be incredibly beneficial and fruitful in your life. And everyone you talk to that does all these things, as have those incredibly special mentors that made you take that next step, in addition to, what's happening in your family and personal background.
Yeah, no, that's true. Mentorship, that can be a lot. And sometimes I think, like you said, even just little moments, like they may not even realize how much of an influence they had on you, right? When you were younger, like as a vet student or something. Sometimes I think we may not even realize little things that we can say, how much that can really mean to someone in the moment.
Completely agree.
And I am a bit curious, though. You said you were thinking about being a dairy farmer, a surgeon, but then you ended up getting a PhD at MD Anderson. How exactly? I don't know. Can you walk us through that journey a little bit?
Yeah, so growing up, there's a place in Wisconsin named Plain, Wisconsin, Plain. It's a town of about 400 people, and about half are Bergmans, and they're almost all dairy farmers. So I remember summers going out there, and I knew forever I wanted to be a veterinarian, but it was what was around me. And as the saying goes, you know what you know. And so I thought when I got to vet school that I was going to become a dairy veterinarian, and then realized that was not for me. I very quickly came to that realization, and, then started thinking about surgery and things like that. And that's when, Withrow and Straw and Ogilvie and all those folks, during vet school, I had that happen. And then I had a grandfather that had metastatic prostate cancer. All those things happened within a very short period of time. And that's when I said, well, maybe we should think about pivoting to cancer. So that really didn't get concreted until the internship at K-State. And then I was lucky enough to come back to Colorado State to do the residency there in the early 90s. It was in my residency that I got, I call it bit by the research bug. Started doing a number of studies, when I was a resident, which I truly enjoyed. I quickly learned that if I was going to learn what was state of the art on the human side, I needed to go embed myself in that type of a training program. And up until that time point, there were extremely few, veterinary oncologists that had done PhDs at all, if not at human cancer centers. So I thought, gosh, am I ready to commit 4, 5, 6, 7 years as a typical robust PhD? And decided, I think it would be worth doing that. And that's what ended up getting me to Houston compared to Duke or Stanford or something like that. And again, so incredibly appreciative. Another mentor that had profound impact on me was Greg McEwen, one of our grandfathers of veterinary oncology. When I was doing my PhD, he did his sabbatic from UW at MD Anderson, mainly based on Josh Fidler's name. And there were a number of other investigators at that department that Greg had immense respect for, one being Jeannie Kleinerman, who's a human medical oncologist for kids with osteosarcoma. And, Greg obviously having a tight connection to the whole osteosarcoma space. And, I knew of him peripherally. You always thought, oh my God, there's the God, there's the book, and blah, blah, blah. And next thing I know, he shows up and he's one lab down from the lab that I was in. And so we got to know each other quite well. And it was always amazing to me that, here is Greg, that's many, many decades into life, many decades into a professional career. And just like me, he was, busting it. He was, there from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. And, he knew that in his sabbatic, he needed to learn what was state of the art in human medicine to take that back to his program at the University of Wisconsin. But he was actually the one that pushed me when I was finishing the PhD to go to AMC. And AMC was not on my radar screen whatsoever. If anything, I thought, oh my God, New York City, that scares me. I don't know if I would even, to be honest, would be considering that. But it was Greg that said, no, Phil, you have to go to AMC because Sloan Kettering is in your backyard and you will do things that you'll never even dream about. And he was so spot on. And so that's sort of how the genesis of the whole melanoma vaccine happened too, because without Greg McKeown pushing me to go to AMC and therefore be in Sloan Kettering's backyard, those connections would have, never been made. And so again, it's amazing how mentors sort of, really guide you through those various things that we're faced with in personal and professional life.
Yeah, that is quite a puzzle, right? And that is really exciting how he was able to help you. Because I was just thinking, you said you were a small town dairy farmer going to New York, right? I mean, that's almost like a movie. So I can imagine how when he was first saying that to you, you were probably like, I don't know, but that is really interesting that he already, knew those connections. And I wanted to kind of dive a little bit more about the melanoma vaccine. You mentioned the osteosarcoma, dogs are a pretty good model, of that cancer, especially because in people, it's a pediatric, it's pretty rare. So trying to get data is a bit more challenging than what we're able to do with dogs. Now, what about melanoma? So I kind of wanted to know, how did that happen? Because while dogs get melanoma, it's usually more in the mouth. And so just thinking of it, and especially when you guys were doing it, people weren't really using dogs as much as a translational model, apart from like hear about hound studies, but I'm talking about dogs that spontaneously get cancer. So how did that whole bridge? I know you said McKeown seemed to already kind of know things were brewing over there, but how did that all come about?
Well, with Greg, since he started the Donaldson Atwood Cancer Clinic many, many years previous, he had all the pieces of the puzzle there. And, it shows you the reverence that he had for AMC, where he's pushing people to go back to his alma mater. And so I went there right away, was introduced to a number of folks at Sloan Kettering, mainly in the cytotoxic side, like Owen O'Connor and a couple of other folks that were on the lymphoma team. And then one night got invited to go to the Princeton Club of all places, and AMC, and at the time, Jed Walchuk, who's the MD PhD that I did the melanoma vaccine work. He's a high flyer on the human side because he's basically an MD PhD that is, basically devoted his life to treating people with melanoma. He's responsible for 3 of the checkpoint inhibitors that are FDA commercially available. True rock star in every way you could think about it. His colleagues would tease him incessantly when he started working with me that he was now becoming a doggy doctor, and he would keep a smile on his face that whole time, even though they were ribbing him. And so anyway, we go to the Princeton Club, and I meet Jed, and super nice guy. But he asked me, and I remember to this day where I was, and when he asked, he said, "Do dogs get melanoma?" And I said, "Yeah, well, why do you ask?" And he goes, "Well, I've got this vaccine that uses a different species DNA to trick the immune system into formulating a response. We've had really good prolongations in survival and safety in mice. But I know I'm 10 to 15 years minimum away from getting this into people. We're putting all the foundations in place to put this into people. And I'm wondering if dogs could be a bridge where we are able to help both dogs as well as then those data turn around and help people. So again, incredible foresight, crazy smart guy. And literally 3 months later, we were taking his vaccine. We slightly changed it in that, this idea of a xenogeneic vaccine, xeno being, different and genetic being sort of the species side of this. And so we quickly realized that if we were going to use that vaccine to make it xenogeneic or a different species to give to people, that was a scenario where they wanted to use mouse origin DNA. And then the beauty of us in veterinary medicine using human DNA for our vaccine was that would be xenogeneic in every veterinary species. So early on, we had a nice mechanism to subset those out so there wouldn't be bleed between the two approaches. And so again, 3 months later, we started putting the vaccine in. We quickly learned it was safe. We started seeing dogs that were sent home essentially to die. I hate to say that, but that, in our world, we know when we've got poor prognosis patients, and we try to be as above board with those clients as but stage 3 and stage 4 melanoma, as has a horrible outcome, typically less than 3 to 6 months, if not even shorter. And so, we would vaccinate those dogs and they would go through protocol, and the owner would then call back 3 months or 6 months later and says, "Hey, Fluffy's still kicking, do you want to see them?" And it's like, yeah. Please bring them back in. And you start to see enough dogs that have disappearance of their pulmonary lesions, dogs that are having prolongation of survival when they got both local control and vaccine. We then started publishing that work. We then realized we needed an industrial partner to take it to the next level. So Jed and I literally flew around the country talking to different animal health companies, and every single one of them, except for one, just literally laughed us out of the room and said, "This is the craziest idea I've ever heard. This is like Star Trek." I would hear the term BS. There's no way this can work. Too crazy. And this whole thing about DNA, and are we going to be turning veterinary patients into humans? And it's like, we obviously don't understand the vaccine technology when you say those kind of things. But it was Mariel at the time that said, and there was a gentleman by the name of Bob Norgren that I'll always be indebted to, not a veterinarian, a scientist. And he talked his team into saying, "Hey, let's give this a better review." And so they funded a couple of additional studies. And we then realized that, one, it looked extremely safe. So I think we had really good data around that. We had significant prolongations in survival. We had, instead of, as you remember, prior to vaccine with surgery, we would typically get somewhere between 3 months and 18 months, depending on the stage of that patient. Digit melanoma, same thing. Half of them were dead at a year and 98% were dead at 2 years without the vaccine. And we started seeing, both gross anti-tumor responses and prolongations in survival. And that's when, I think Mariel at the time, who now, got bought by Boehringer, they saw utility in this. So we set up a USDA registration trial. I'll also remember during that time point that when we did that study, we were about, I want to say, 2.5 years into allowing the data to mature, have those patients tell us, are we doing well or are we doing poorly? And we had not reached what we call a median survival time, meaning that, we still had, I think it was like 70% of the dogs were alive at that 2.5 year mark. And I remember, those industrial colleagues saying, "Well, Dr. Bergman, we don't have a median survival time yet. So I don't think that's good and we should wait." And I said, "Oh my God, are you crazy? It's a good thing that we don't have a median survival time because we've not crossed over that 50% threshold. And we may be here another 2 years from now and maybe still never cross that 50% threshold." So I said, "Yeah, you got to send that back to the government." And so that's what we did as a team. And that's when it converted from conditional licensure to full licensure in 2009. We were really proud of that moment because it was the first therapeutic vaccine for cancer that was approved by the US government. HPV vaccine on the human side was the first preventative vaccine for cancer. So yeah, it was a really proud moment. And I know for Jed, he had shared with me that even though obviously he's an MD PhD, it was something that he was very proud of as well. And all of the stuff that we did together rolled up to a lot of their applications on the human side as well. So I quickly learned that, veterinary and human cancer centers can get along, they can collaborate, and they can work well together. We are better working together to address really difficult to answer fundamental biologic questions that we need in the clinic.
So much to take away from that journey. I mean, even what you were just saying now and how he saw like, yeah, this is working in the mouse, but I know it's such a leap to the person, right? And that's where I agree. I feel like the dog is such a great middle of the road option, because when they get like melanoma, they get it spontaneously. So it's such a better model than just the mouse, and when we're able to use things like the melanoma vaccine on our dogs, then we get new therapies for our dogs, and then helping the science towards people. So to me, I agree. It seems like such a win-win. And it sounds like you went through so many challenges and really to overcome to get such a like you said, a monumental thing. It's the first cancer vaccine, which is really exciting. What would you say was the biggest challenge? I mean, it sounds like getting an industrial partner was pretty hard. I mean, is that what you would say was the biggest, or what would you say from that whole journey was the biggest challenge?
Yeah, it was up there because again, most of them thought this was way too crazy an idea to work. One of the other aspects, and this I think is a great segue from what you just said related to the model aspect, is that invariably when I would present that work to a bunch of MDs, literally every time that would happen, they would either ask me live or they would pull me to the side if they were embarrassed to ask, in public. They would ask me, and I know that you'll giggle over this because you'll inherently get it, but they'll say, well, I just don't understand this stuff about dogs and melanoma because, you take somebody's dog and take them into the back. That was the other thing that they would say, which I snickered about. But they would ask them, we go give the dog melanoma in the back of the clinic. And I was like, no. This is the fundamental thing that they don't understand because, in their world, it's either a person or it's a model. And that model is obviously often with mice. And as you know, most of the time, those are not spontaneous formed cancers. They're induced, or they're given to mice that have poor immune systems, so they can't reject those tumor cells. So very artificial. We all, for folks that have experience in centers that do mouse work, I wish I could be a mouse oncologist because you cure a heck of a lot more patients than you do through other means because it's a very artificial, very atypical, it doesn't represent the biology that you and I are used to seeing in our patients. And so it was very eye-opening to me when those physicians would say that, because it was obvious that they didn't understand, no, this is a spontaneous disease model that is no different. They have intact immune systems as far as we can tell. Those immune systems age over time, no differently than in people. The disease metastasizes to the same exact bizarre places like it does in people, like meninges, adrenal glands, stuff that you can't predict based on, flow of blood, and gets back to the whole seed and soil hypothesis, that there's something unique about that soil for that specific seed or metastatic cancer cell. So it's a really cool thought as to how that all kind of came together. And when you then got that MD to realize, oh my God, this is a dog that lives in our world, eats and sleeps and drinks and does all the things that we do, but it spontaneously develops. So it has all those pressures. They then start to go, that's when the light bulb goes off and they go, oh, now I get it. This is not induced. This is really representing what we do in the clinic side. And unfortunately, as you know, our patients don't live as long as people. And so that timeline is compressed as well. So we have a unique ability, as you know, in veterinary oncology, we can address some questions that may not necessarily be so easily addressed on the human side. I think back to when we first started it, we were constantly beating that drum of, spontaneous animal disease. And, we would all talk about one medicine, one health. And sometimes that would get co-opted by the zoonotic side or this or that. But we, thanks to McEwen's and Withrow's and Vales and folks like that, we're now in a very different space when you move forward to a couple generations now, where our models, which I snicker as well at that because they're not really models. These are the patients that you and I are seeing all the time, that in fact, they represent the very best way to interrogate new diagnostics or new therapeutics. And it was gratifying when Jed Wolchuk came to that realization as well. And he would say that publicly, that you guys should really be thinking about these veterinary correlates and surrogates to try and better figure out what's working versus not. And I think the osteosarcoma field, recognized that the first, melanoma recognized that second. So now it's becoming, relatively commonplace, and it makes the jobs of like the people at the comparative oncology wing at the National Cancer Institute, Amy and those folks, they have it a lot easier now than the folks did 30 years ago, because I think it's finally become much more commonplace for people to agree with that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it is interesting, like you said, like people actually thought we were growing tumors on pet dogs, versus because it never occurred to them. Like, clearly had never had a pet with cancer before. And, when I tell people about how good of a model, like how much could we share and learn together? Our dogs get cancer. It's unfortunate, but when it happens, what can we do where we could actually learn from each other? Like I was saying, medications. And I think a lot of people get excited about that, of thinking, like, oh, maybe I will be part of this clinical trial, because not only could this maybe help my dog, but it could help other dogs down the road, and maybe even people, with some of the things, depending on what you're investigating. So it is exciting. And I certainly appreciate all the hard work that you guys did early on of trying to get that into people's heads and understand, like, hey, this can be one health, and really trying to explain to people how we can help each other. So I certainly, as an oncologist now, really appreciate that work that you guys have been doing over the last few decades.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yep.
Yeah, and kind of talking about new technology and things, is there anything out that you find exciting on the horizon with veterinary oncology, or maybe something in human that you think might come over our way? What are you excited about right now?
Yeah, there's a couple things brewing. One of which, as you know, at VCS just got announced, a couple weeks ago with Gilvetmab, the new checkpoint inhibitor. I've been working with Merck since 2015 on that molecule, and made a couple trips to Ames, Iowa on its behalf. Now we have that commercially available, and there are 9 of those products on the human side that are FDA approved. We have one in veterinary medicine, which is conditionally licensed. I see how those checkpoint inhibitors have revolutionized the treatment of human cancer. For your viewers, especially those that may not necessarily know what these products are, you see the commercials on TV all the time. I always say that's living longer with your cancer commercials. As you know, cancer cells have gotten so crazy smart, they know where to touch our T cells to tell them to turn off. And so now they've designed some drugs to stop that. So it basically takes the brakes off of your own immune system. Depending on the histology or cancer type, we see some, like the liquid tumors like lymphomas and leukemias, that don't seem to respond to those. But then you see the melanomas where it's 40-50%. And what's remarkable about it is that that's all they get. It's not like they're getting some vaccine or something else with it. They're, again, getting a product that allows your own immune system to take off and not be inhibited by those cancer cells pinging them left and right to turn off. The vast majority of the people, in fact, New England Journal of Medicine just last week came out with a really cool paper that showed that people that stopped taking the maintenance phase of that drug that were already in remission, so they declined to continue to get the drug. They wanted to know, how did those patients do? And 98% stayed in remission. So there's now accumulating data that shows that if you get a complete remission with one of your checkpoint inhibitors, you very likely are cured forever. Most of the data shows that. So we now have one of those products in veterinary medicine. And going back to Jed Wolchuk, the gentleman I talked earlier about that we developed the melanoma vaccine with, I remember his words, so it would have been 2011, 2012. He uses this thought that we got the pendulum, and for years and years we've been on this side of the pendulum, meaning a very antigen-based approach where we train the immune system to go after whatever, maybe a peptide vaccine, maybe an RNA vaccine, or in the melanoma vaccines perspective, it was a DNA-based vaccine. But it was, again, we were training the immune system to go after an antigen. You now move forward to today, the pendulum has completely swung to the other side where it's an antigen-independent approach through checkpoint inhibitors. So it's agnostic of the cancer type, which is kind of cool when you think about it, that you could have a product that would be like that. But the problem is that the funny saying they have at Sloan Kettering is yeah, it's magic. 20 to 30% of the time it works. And when it works, it works. Well, the problem is they're crazy expensive molecules. They're $150,000 to $200,000. And when it only works 20 to 30% of the time, you need better predictive factors, and insurance companies get cranky because, most of the time it doesn't work. We now are on the precipice of having our first one, and all the initial data, which our shop was one of the sites that did the pilot study for mast cell and for melanoma. And we very much recapitulated that 20 to 30%. When it works, it works. I'm super happy that we finally have one in our toolkit. I kind of feel like we're at a similar time point to when Rituxan first came out on the human side, which was 97. Things exploded on the human side with all of those therapeutics. There's now over 200 that are approved for different types of cancer in people. We now have our first checkpoint inhibitor. So I have no doubt that in addition to, on-label use, that oncologists are going to use it at a lot of different things, and we're going to learn a lot of things as we go. Plus, I'm proud to say that Merck is, that they have a grant program where you put in interesting ideas and they'll then fund that by giving you free drug to try to answer those important fundamental questions that we have with it. So I think it's one of the most exciting times to be in oncology, because I think we're now starting to get some therapeutics that really do make a lot of sense rationally, have a good scientific basis behind them, are really well categorized and worked up to know that they bind to their target of interest, because we've had some ups and downs with that in veterinary medicine over time with like some of the Aratana products. We're on the precipice, I think, of truly impacting in major ways how we treat our patients. And to go back to the pendulum discussion, so again, we were antigen here, we then went checkpoint. And what Jed said back in 2011, 2012, he goes, I predict, Phil, that we will have a day coming sometime in the next 10, 15 years where the pendulum goes back to the middle, where we do both. We do antigen and we do checkpoint. That hopefully gets us out of that 20 to 30%. When it magically works, it works. So we start thinking about combination approaches, and that's always been the holy grail that we always talk about. We go to the meetings and combination, but we barely have one, as never mind combinations. So we're now at that point where we can be rationally thinking about it. And we know from the human side that a lot of those checkpoint inhibitors allow radiation to work better and potentially create immune responses, or we call abscopal responses. So yeah, it's crazy exciting to have an agent like that. And, it also generates more interest in veterinary oncology, because that, I think, is a hard thing for a lot of folks to understand, is that a blockbuster on the human side is a multi-billion-dollar drug per year. In veterinary medicine, that's a couple million. You want those $50 to $100 million drugs like you see in the anthelmintic space and vaccine space. But we don't have those yet in veterinary oncology. So it's really up to us to prove that market, in fact, does exist. And it's hard for companies because they look at the return on investment and say, oh, Blockbuster is multi-billion-dollar drug on veterinary medicine. It's 50 to 100 million. Does my ROI add up? But, we both know as practicing clinical oncologists that we still see plenty of cancer out there that doesn't have a really good standard of care, and we can do better. So I have no doubt that, and knowing, if I kind of wear my clinician scientist hat, which is what I do when I'm not in the clinic, there is some incredibly cool stuff that's coming to veterinary medicine. Bispecific antibodies, things that grab two things at once, that are known to work a lot better, and better immune engagers. I constantly worry about who's going to be able to afford them, because, these are agents that are not of trivial expense. They have come way down for cost of goods, but, in the end, there's just based on that ROI side of things. If these companies don't make money, they're not going to give us products. So there has to be a balance there. Seeing the things that are coming, I know that, and that's why I framed this around that rituximab idea, where that's what blew up human oncology and started the whole thing. And I think we're similar to that now, and more of these agents will be in our hands over time.
Yeah, I agree. We're kind of on that precipice, right? People are getting excited. We're getting interest, new products. I think some of it's going to be training the veterinarian how to use it too, though, because I think sometimes vets, when you hear 20, 30% response, they're like, oh, I'm not going to mess with it. But it's like, no, but for the ones it works really well. Like we shouldn't necessarily just blow it off, because otherwise, for like these melanomas, if you can't do much of anything else, like you said, they're kind of sent home to pass away. So why not try? Even if it's lower, it's better than what you were going to do otherwise, right? And I think with a lot of these different things, it's going to be educating the community and the pricing. That's something you hear a lot about, people talking about the price of veterinary medicine. Personally, I think it's probably going to have to be insurance at some level, trying to help with some of these prices. I know I always tell like friends or family, like when they get puppies, I say get insurance. And I'm saying no, because of course they're always thinking about cancer when I say it. And I'm like, I know you just got a puppy, but even if this puppy eats something and you have to have emergency surgery, do you have the cash sitting around to pay for that? Because it can be several thousands of dollars anywhere in the country, not just on the coast.
Yeah, I'm wholly aligned with that. I constantly say it bothers me that our industry has not trained our clients to recognize that when you get a puppy, yeah, there's some costs, related to spay, neuter, and vaccines and all those things. And then you go to middle age and there's usually less. Then you get to older age and there's some catastrophe, whether that's hit by a car or develop diabetes or develop cancer or whatever that spontaneous disease is. I tell all my friends that are not veterinary related that, if an $8,000 bill is something you can handle as a family easily, you don't need insurance. But if that $8,000 bill is going to wreck your family's insurance, then somewhat like an annuity that you pay into, you should really think about getting insurance. And you and I know of case after case after case where it's a financial-based euthanasia, which I hate. It's one of the worst feelings in the world that a client can't do even any level of standard of care, and then that translates into a euthanasia of that patient. And one of the best words that we hear in specialty is, I have insurance. Because we know that that's a client that then is going to be able to afford standard of care therapeutics, whether that's hit by car or a bloat or cancer. There's even studies that I'm sure you've seen that suggest that there's a greater chance that you'll diagnose a certain type of cancer when they have insurance, because owners come in and they get that lump or bump checked out. And, it's exactly why at VCA that we've partnered with one of those insurance companies, because we really believe in their mission. But yeah, we've done a really poor job of telling the public that there's going to be a major event that happens in that animal's life, whether it's like you said, in middle life or end of life. And if you're not financially prepared for that, get insurance, because it will pay off.
I totally agree. And I think it'll be interesting to see how things play out. And I always try to explain to people too, if medical costs are going up for us, that trickles down to veterinary medicine, because so many of the products, everything we use it's coming from the same places, or industry, like you said, they're looking at the same expectations. They're like, well, is it worth going into vet med? So I hope they continue to see us as a good market so we can keep having good options for our dogs and cats and various pets that people have. And, as we're wrapping up this talk, and I think it's really been exciting to hear all the different things that you've been involved with, and the One Health, and, kind of where we're heading in veterinary medicine. I'm just wondering if there's anyone else that you recommend that we should interview on this podcast.
The name that automatically comes to mind, just because, I think of him as one of our preeminent clinician scientists in veterinary oncology, is Doug Tham. He's one that I would think of. Another is Heather Wilson Robles. And part of why I think about her is, she was foundational to the Nu.Q blood test. She has navigated a lot of things when it comes to kind of the obstacles piece that you talked about previously. And I think she could probably have some journey aspects that she could share with you from both personal travails in addition to what she's been through with Nu.Q and, some of the things where her professional journey has taken her currently. I think that would be a pretty interesting discussion as well.
Yeah, no, those all sound great. Thank you so much. We'll certainly have to reach out to those guys. And yeah, I think those could all be great conversations. And again, thank you so much for being on today. I really learned a lot. I hope other people have, if they didn't know, really understanding, like to me, it's that One Health. It's how much we can help each other. I just feel passionate about that because that's where I really see we can all progress, both animals and people. So thank you so much for all the work you do in that arena. And we'll continue to see, the Go Vet Mab. I was hoping you were going to say that because that's what I thought you were going to say. And I'm really excited to see, one, what they get out of all those grants. I think that was brilliant that they're doing that. And then also with the vaccine, the melanoma vaccine, like how can we charge up the immune system with all this? So stay tuned. It's exciting. Hopefully we'll get all these results, over time.
Well, baby steps. I so want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you and all the folks that watch you. So I greatly, greatly appreciate it.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Veterinary Cancer Pioneers Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and gained valuable insight, we would be so grateful if you could share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And it would be even more wonderful if you want to give us a 5-star rating, positive review, or any kind of feedback on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. The Veterinary Cancer Pioneers Podcast is presented to you by ImpriMed.